Imagine you're going about your business when out of nowhere you're stopped by the police, asked to show ID, even though you haven't broken any laws. Now picture the officers not knowing the legal boundaries they're supposed to enforce. What happens when their lack of legal knowledge is exposed in real time? In this video, we dive into one of the most intense First Amendment audits yet, where female cops get caught off guard during a routine ID refusal. Watch as the officers struggle to understand what's required by law, and the tension builds when their own authority is questioned. Are they truly upholding the law, or are they simply relying on outdated procedures? This interaction highlights the importance of knowing your rights and the consequences of ignorance on both sides. Stay tuned as we reveal how the situation escalates and what unfolds next, because the story isn't over yet. As the situation unfolds, it becomes clear that the officers are out of their depth. One of them, a senior officer, tries to assert her authority, but her responses are shaky. She keeps repeating the same questions, asking for ID, demanding answers that just aren't required by law. The other officer, younger and visibly uncertain, seems to be relying on her partner for guidance. But the senior officer is struggling, unable to properly articulate why the person in question needs to provide identification. It's a moment that leaves everyone wondering. How many cops out there are equally uninformed about the laws they're sworn to enforce? The tension in the air is palpable as the person being questioned calmly, but firmly asserts their rights. They stand their ground, quoting legal principles that leave the officers scrambling for answers. What happens next could set the stage for a serious legal battle, but for now, everything hangs in the balance. The atmosphere grows even more charged as the officer's frustration becomes evident. She begins raising her voice, attempting to intimidate, but the person being questioned remains calm, focused, and unwavering in their knowledge of the law. They calmly explain that, according to the Fourth Amendment, they are not required to provide ID unless there's a clear suspicion of criminal activity. The senior officer's grip on the situation weakens, and she starts making vague threats, suggesting that refusal to provide identification could lead to detainment or worse. But even those threats seem hollow, because they don't have a solid legal basis. Meanwhile, the younger officer watches silently, seemingly torn between following orders and questioning the legitimacy of the whole interaction. Her hesitation hints at doubt about the legitimacy of the authority she's been trained to trust without question. She keeps glancing at her partner, looking for guidance, but it's clear that the situation is spiraling beyond their control. In the background, a small crowd begins to form, drawn in by the growing tension. Some are filming, others whispering amongst themselves. For the officers, this only adds pressure, as now they're under the watchful eyes of bystanders who might be ready to hold them accountable for any misstep. What happens next could be a turning point, not just for the officers, but for everyone witnessing this tense standoff. Yet, with every moment that passes, the situation only seems to become more uncertain. The situation reaches a boiling point as the senior officer, her frustration bubbling over, takes a step forward, trying to tower over the person refusing to provide their ID. Her voice rises, demanding compliance, but each word rings with uncertainty. The crowd around them begins to murmur, sensing the tension building. Some individuals in the crowd start recording, their phones raised, capturing every moment. The scene is growing more intense by the second, and it's clear that the officer's attempts to regain control are only making things worse. The younger officer shifts uncomfortably on her feet, her gaze flickering from her partner to the person standing their ground. She's beginning to realize that the legal foundation beneath her partner's actions might be shaky at best. But what can she do? She's caught between loyalty to her partner and the undeniable sense that something isn't right. The inner conflict is written all over her face, yet she says nothing. The crowd's murmurs grow louder. Some people are starting to side with the person refusing to comply, questioning the officer's actions. The senior officer's response is quick, but it's vague and contradicts what she said earlier. At this moment, it's impossible to ignore. The officers don't have a solid legal reason to keep the person detained. But what happens next? The tension is unbearable as the officers seem poised to make a decision that could escalate the situation even further. Just as the senior officer is about to speak again, her radio crackles to life, cutting through the thick silence. The voice on the other end is urgent, but the words are muffled by static. She pulls the radio closer, her brow furrowing in confusion as she listens. The tension is palpable. Everyone is watching, waiting for the next move. The younger officer looks even more unsettled now, glancing back and forth between her partner and the growing crowd, who are beginning to feel more emboldened as the seconds tick by. Then out of nowhere, a second squad car pulls up to the scene, screeching to a halt. Two more officers emerge. One of them, a seasoned officer known for her aggressive tactics, strides toward the group with an air of authority. She immediately assesses the situation and turns to the senior officer, her eyes narrowing. "What's going on here?" she demands, her voice sharp. The senior officer hesitates, clearly caught off guard. Her grip on the situation had already been shaky, but with the arrival of the new officer, the balance of power shifts. The new officer quickly assesses the scene, and without waiting for a full explanation, she steps toward the person being questioned. "You're refusing to comply," she asks coldly, her tone more hostile than any of the earlier officers. The person stands firm, repeating their rights once more. But before they can finish, the seasoned officer grabs for their arm, attempting to detain them. The crowd reacts immediately, some shouting, others pulling out their phones to record what could be the moment it all goes too far. Just as the situation threatens to spiral completely out of control, the senior officer stammers, realizing something critical. She pulls her partner aside, whispering urgently. The crowd grows quieter, sensing a shift in the air. What new twist has just unfolded? Is the situation about to escalate into an arrest? Or could this be the breaking point where the officers have no choice but to back down? The stakes are higher than ever, and the clock is ticking. The tension reaches its breaking point as the seasoned officer tries to forcefully grab the person's arm. But before she can get a firm grip, the senior officer steps forward, holding her back. "Wait," she calls out, her voice shaking. I think we might be in the wrong here." She looks at her partner, who now looks completely lost, and then at the seasoned officer. "We don't have the grounds to detain them." The crowd falls silent for a moment, as if time itself is holding its breath. The senior officer's admission shocks everyone, including the seasoned officer, who freezes mid-motion, her hands still hovering in the air. The person standing firm doesn't move an inch, their eyes locked onto the officers, calmly watching the unfolding scene. There's a sense of quiet victory in their stance, but they don't gloat. They simply stood their ground, using knowledge and patience as their shield. Just as the seasoned officer seems ready to argue, the senior officer speaks again, her voice now more certain. "You're right," she says. There's a long pause. The seasoned officer's face hardens, but the senior officer looks at her, almost relieved. The crowd reacts in surprise, the shift in the officer's perspective not lost on anyone. It's a moment of introspection and growth, something rare in an environment where officers are often pressured to follow procedures without question. With a final glance at the person who stood their ground, the senior officer nods. "Go ahead." "You're free to go," she says, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful. As the person walks away, the crowd begins to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves about what just happened. But the twist doesn't end there. As the officers prepare to leave, the seasoned officer, now visibly shaken, pulls out a phone. She looks at the senior officer and says, "We're going to have to do something about this. You know that, right?" The camera zooms in on her phone screen, showing an internal police memo that suggests a department-wide initiative to educate officers on legal rights. But beneath the surface, there's a hint of something darker. Could this encounter spark a larger investigation into police practices? Or was this simply a wake-up call for a few officers, and nothing more? The audience is left wondering as the camera pans away, leaving the question of reform hanging in the air. As the officers head back to their vehicles, the atmosphere remains tense but quieter. The seasoned officer's phone buzzes with a new message, but she pockets it, avoiding further conversation with her partner. The senior officer, though shaken, seems to have a newfound resolve. She glances at the younger officer, who nods, her face a mix of relief and contemplation. There's no clear resolution on whether the department will change, but the seed of doubt has been planted, and it's impossible to ignore. For the person who stood their ground, it's a quiet victory, not one of confrontation, but of asserting rights calmly and with knowledge. As they walk away, the crowd disbands, and the officers drive off in separate directions, each with their thoughts. The encounter becomes a reminder of the importance of knowing your rights, and the power of standing firm in the face of uncertainty. In the end, while the immediate conflict is over, the broader question remains: will this moment spark real change? Only time will tell.